September 1939, and Nazi Germany attacks Poland. The start of World War II. A month earlier, Albert Einstein had met with Leo Szilard, the Hungarian immigrant physicist. Szilard and others drafted a letter to President Roosevelt, which Einstein agreed to sign. The letter informed the president of the work of Szilard and of another immigrant physicist, Enrico Fermi, confirmed the German discovery of uranium fission, and cited evidence that the Nazis were beginning research on a nuclear bomb. Roosevelt recognized this danger and ordered support for research. It seemed clear that the United States had no choice but to enter the dreadful atomic race. The key question to answer first was whether a chain reaction in uranium could really be set up. Fermi and Szilard led the work in self-imposed secrecy. Because slow neutrons were more likely to produce fission, the uranium was to be embedded in a moderating substance that would slow the neutrons. Carbon in the form of graphite, if it were pure enough, was the most promising substance. So a pile of uranium and graphite was built at Columbia University. Fermi explained later how graphite was tested.
What was happening is that in those days we were trying to learn something about the absorption properties of graphite, because perhaps graphite was no good. So we built columns of graphite, maybe 4 feet on the side or something like that, maybe 10 feet high. So physicists on the 7th floor of Pupin Laboratory started looking like coal miners. It was the first time when apparatus in physics was so big that you could climb on top of it.
In December 1941, it became clear that a chain reaction was likely to occur with a bigger pile and purer graphite. And if that were true, a piece of pure uranium itself might well be made into a weapon. It was decided to expand the research program. Ironically, the very next day, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor pushed America into the war. All human resources now had to be mobilized, including the scientists. The pile project was moved from Columbia University in New York to Chicago. Labs were established at the University of Chicago in a deserted squash court under the grandstand of a football field. An odd location, but it was secure. And now secrecy was more essential than ever. The American physicist Arthur H. Compton was in charge of the whole operation. Fermi was to direct the test of whether a large uranium-carbon pile would really sustain a chain reaction. This was no longer basic research, but urgent war work. Fermi was again the same effective leader he had been in his lab in Rome. The young nuclear physicists on his team responded to his zest and warmth.
I think the main point of his attraction was the intimate way in which he did physics. He dealt with it directly, and he dealt with it with you. He never left it to you. He always talked about the work as, in a sense, as an adventure on which we were both on and that we would do together jointly. That is, we had those of us who worked with him had a sense of participation in the experiment.
There is no film or photograph of the pile they built, only this painting and a model. Fermi later described the pile.
It's bricks of graphite piled up in this pile. There is uranium spread throughout the interior. Some neutrons produced in the uranium collide against the graphite, be slowed down to the appropriate energy, react again with uranium, produce more neutrons, and so on and so forth.
The final test began. As long as the control rods were in place, they absorbed enough neutrons to keep the pile from self-sustaining reaction. On the morning of December 2nd, 1942, Fermi directed that the control rods be slowly pulled out until only one was left. This was pulled out by hand step by step. With each step, the meters showed that the activity of the pile increased. Then, on the brink of history, Fermi called a lunch break.
After lunch, we resumed, and at 3:25 p.m., I remember the time because I wrote it on the rubber balloon that encased the structure. We resumed, and by this time, Fermi was in full control, and he knew precisely how far to pull the last rod out. He gave me my instructions, and he announced to the those attending that we would now have a chain reaction, and sure enough, we did.
Arthur Compton could now make his report.
I picked up the phone and called Dr. Conant at Cambridge. The Italian navigator has just landed in the New World, I told him.
The Italian navigator had indeed landed in a new world. A new kind of fire had been ignited that showed the possibility both of peaceful nuclear power and of the nuclear bomb. As it turned out later, the Germans too were constructing a uranium pile. To produce the pure raw materials, uranium-235 and plutonium, a monumental enterprise sprang up across America, the two largest plants being at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. The basic theory for the weapon was being developed at Los Alamos, some 40 miles from Santa Fe in New Mexico, in what had been a boys' school, now heavily secured. The overall direction of the project rested with the Army, who selected Robert Oppenheimer as chief scientist. The local people in town thought the site might be a concentration camp for enemy aliens. It was true that along with American scientists, Oppenheimer had many foreigners in his camp. Fermi, who came to Los Alamos to help where he could, Edward Teller, a Hungarian, and Emilio Segre, once Fermi's student and his friend and colleague from Rome. Among the many Americans involved were Lawrence and Robbie, who came as consultants. By the summer of 1945, the complicated design problems seemed solved. The raw material was ready, and the Army could make the arrangements to test whether an explosive reaction would occur. A stretch of desert to the south at Alamogordo was chosen as the test site. In the early dawn of July 16th, all was ready. Ironically, the war with Germany had just ended in May. Some of the scientists were hoping that the awesome results predicted on paper would somehow turn out to be forbidden by nature's laws after all. The enormous heat of the explosion turned the desert sand to glass. The scientists were awed. The war with Japan was clearly in its final phase, and some of the scientists wrote petitions to the president to use atomic weapons, if at all, on non-civilian targets. President Truman decided otherwise. At his orders in early August 1945, the Air Force dropped 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Historians are still debating whether the Japanese generals would not have surrendered soon anyway. But the long and terribly costly war was over. 2 weeks after the end of the war, a very different explosion occurred. The scientists who had been working for the Army rebelled because the Army wanted to keep the same security on research as during wartime. Samuel Allison spoke for them.
We are determined to return to free research as before the war. If the exchange of scientific information was prohibited by military regulation, research workers in America would leave the field of atomic research and devote themselves to studying the color of butterfly wings.
Fermi agreed wholeheartedly, stating publicly that research must be freed from military supervision if nuclear science were to be developed for the benefit of all mankind. As he explained later,
Of course, we knew that atomic energy was potentially capable also of peaceful applications. One of them is the possibility of producing large-scale amounts of energy with a fuel of very little weight. This feature could make atomic energy useful in some situations in which ordinary fuels might not be practical. Also, the reaction produces as byproducts huge amounts of radioactive substances. They can be used for all sorts of purposes in physics, chemistry, and especially in medicine.
Steps towards the attainment of these peaceful applications were taken even as Fermi returned to the University of Chicago to begin the last great phase of his career. Looking, as ever, for interesting problems in new fields, he turned to the physics of subnuclear particles.
Enrico had a tremendous interest in any new piece of apparatus. It didn't matter whether it was a complicated computer or whether it was, I remember an example of a lawnmower. He had never worked a power lawnmower. And I had just gotten this power lawnmower, and he was out at the house, and he saw it, wanted to see how it worked, and wanted to do it. Whereupon he cut my lawn, which I think was a tremendous honor to have your professor cut your lawn. His equipment would essentially disintegrate just when he finished getting all the relevant, pertinent data that he needed. He didn't waste his time, which many physicists today do, building very expensive, sophisticated equipment. He just designed his equipment to do the job that was necessary in order to get the results that he was trying to attain, and after that he didn't have to worry anymore about the equipment.
He had a very high sense of economy of time and effort, and he was used to quote a few verses that he thought were due to Michelangelo. Quando hai fatto tanto che ti par che basta, non lo toccare più se no ci guasta. When you have made enough that you believe that is sufficient, don't touch it anymore because you will spoil it.
In the summer vacations, he returned to the New Mexico mountains near Los Alamos. Again, he organized hikes and trips with his colleagues and their families, always combining friendship and talk about physics as he had done with his students in Rome a generation before. One of his frequent companions was Norman Knockjeeb.
He rather enjoyed stirring a pot of beans and cooking bacon. And perhaps he didn't do this at home, that I don't know, but he liked to make breakfast in the morning on these camping trips. Enrico would stop the car and get out his fishing pole, and some of the younger ones of us took our diversion by panning for gold. He didn't catch any fish, and we didn't succeed in getting any gold.
It was in the post-war period in Chicago. He founded another school, both in experiment and theory, and some of the most significant younger exponents of physics, both theoretical and experimental, were directly his students.
And they remember Fermi the teacher with pride and pleasure.
Fermi loved to teach. He seemed to get almost a physical pleasure from it. He loved to teach so much that he almost seemed to delight in people who didn't understand what he was saying the first time.
One of the major purposes of his life was to make things clear, and he made them clear to himself, and he made them clear to others. His idea was, well, it helped him understand things in a way, to explain them.
And he always was able to single out those aspects of the problem which are the really essential ones, so that once you grasp those points, you have a superior view of what the whole problem is about.
I felt that the circumstances under which I could learn from him were just about ideal. Namely, I worked on a problem for a matter of a few weeks, and then came in contact with Fermi to discuss it, and he would show me how to make progress on a problem on which I had already worked.
Each step, as it unfolded to his mind, he would put down, and he would be led along until he came to the conclusion. And when he'd finished, if you took a picture of that
Mm-hmm.
blackboard, you would have the basis of a well-organized paper. for a scientific journal.
He liked to do a little one-upsmanship, and some of this was this business of having only one piece of chalk. It's very difficult to argue with somebody who has the only piece of chalk.
He would put himself questions, or whenever there was an idle moment, whenever he was strolling along, his mind was working on some feature of the world which had caught his attention, to see if he could put it into place, he could take it apart, see how it was working. Sometimes he put these questions in a rather surprising way, just to make a kind of joke, a kind of real puzzle. They were not quite puzzles, but they were almost puzzles. He would look at you and say, this famous one, which is often told of him, how many piano tuners do you think there are in Chicago? Oh, you feel you have to look that up. But of course, you don't have to look that up. You just have to ask yourself, you can approach a problem many different ways about how many people have pianos, how many houses are there, what chances there have a piano, how often does it have to be tuned, how many pianos can a man tune in a day, and pretty soon you have a rough answer. Oh, you won't know exactly, but you'll know it's not thousands or not ones, but somewhere in between. And of course, the better you know the subject, the more you'll be able to answer it. Questions of this sort, Fermi questions.
There were other questions for which Fermi felt there were no quick answers. These were political and moral questions that agitated many other scientists. After the war, the scientists who were concerned about the spread of nuclear weapons got together and formed the Federation of American Scientists. A chief aim was to keep the development of atomic energy under civilian control in the U.S. Fermi tried to stay out of such debates, but events soon forced him to take a public stand. In the 1950s, a senator, Joseph McCarthy, became more and more feared for his witch hunts. This distortion of the Senate's powers distressed Fermi, who had a deep-rooted respect for government and institutions.
He had a good deal of trust that when the military said they had a requirement, they must know what they were talking about. And he had a tendency to suppose that those who, in some vague sense, were the government, must be quite expert at that, as he was expert at physics.
In the atmosphere generated by McCarthy, a sensationalistic book appeared, which caused Fermi to call a press conference, a rare thing for him. He felt the book was unfair to many of his friends and colleagues, and flatly said so. Then Oppenheimer himself was attacked. The man who directed the vast secret research work at Los Alamos and served in his country's highest councils was accused of being a security risk. Fermi was outraged and testified on Oppenheimer's behalf. At last he saw it was impossible for scientists to stay aloof when political decisions were being made that involved science and scientists. Oppenheimer, interviewed in the last month of his life, later recalled,
he realized that some of the things that had come to him, many of them things that had come to several of us together, were pretty hard, and that he no longer felt entirely content with the way in which he had dealt with them.
In that turbulent summer of 1954, Fermi left a deeply troubled America for a visit to his native Italy. As always, science filled his days, in the lecture room and in informal conversation with his friends and colleagues. It was Fermi's last trip. He came home to discover that he had an incurable cancer.
The day after the operation, Herbert Anderson and I went to see him in the hospital. And when we went there, we knew, and he also knew, that he had only a few months more to live. When you meet a man at that time, you really do not know what to say. Fermi turned to me and said, well, don't look so unhappy. For a man after 50, nothing really new is likely to happen. And it is probably more of the same thing. And so there is not much laws to be anticipated. And then he turned to me with a smile and said, "Now you tell me as an Indian, do you think I will be an elephant next time?" And sort of laughed and broke the whole gloom of the first encounter.
On the 29th of November, 1954, Enrico Fermi died.
His impact during his lifetime very great in the professional community among physicists. He was deeply loved, imitated as far as it lay in people's power to do so by very many. He changed the style in which a whole set of problems were thought about and the language that was used.
He gave me the impression of a superb musician who, when presented a piece of music for the first time, is able to play it with extraordinary eloquence. In the same way, he was able to bring to bear on any problem presented to him his enormous understanding of physics.
Fermi had a tremendous ability to bring out the simplicity and the beauty in physics. And to many of us, and probably I suppose to most physicists, it is the beauty of the subject which is the most characteristic and attractive feature.
During the 53 years of Fermi's life, the course of physics, and with it history itself, had undergone a profound transformation, and in good part as a result of his work. But the search for simplicity and beauty through the ideas of physics is still as important as it was in Fermi's world.